Have you ever thought about why some people win battles but lose wars? Have you ever noticed how the person who shows mercy to their enemy often ends up destroyed by that same enemy later? There's a brutal truth at the heart of conflict that most people are too civilized, too kind, or too naive to accept, and today we're going to explore one of the most controversial and misunderstood laws of power ever articulated. This video will change how you see conflict, how you understand mercy, how you approach your enemies, and how you protect yourself in a world that's far more dangerous than you want to believe. Because what I'm about to tell you goes against everything you've been taught about forgiveness, compassion, and taking the high road. Yet it's been proven true across thousands of years of human history, in warfare, in business, in politics, and in personal conflicts. The truth is this: if you must fight an enemy, you must crush them totally. Half measures create more problems than they solve. Mercy to your enemy is cruelty to yourself. Leaving an enemy wounded but alive guarantees they will return stronger and more determined to destroy you. This is Law 15 from the 48 Laws of Power: crush your enemy totally. And before you recoil in horror at the brutality of this law, before you dismiss it as immoral or unnecessarily harsh, understand that this principle could save your life, your career, your reputation, or your business. Because the enemy you show mercy to today will show you none tomorrow. But here's what makes this law so dangerous and so frequently violated: we live in a society that glorifies mercy, forgiveness, and taking the high road. We're taught from childhood that it's noble to forgive your enemies, to show mercy, to be the bigger person. And in many contexts, with certain kinds of conflicts, this is good advice. But in serious conflicts with serious enemies, this advice is catastrophically wrong. It's the advice of people who've never faced a truly dangerous enemy. It's the idealism of those who've been protected from the brutal realities of power struggles. And following this advice when the stakes are high will get you destroyed. So let me ask you, have you ever shown mercy to an enemy who came back to destroy you? Have you ever defeated someone but left them with the ability to retaliate, and then faced their revenge later? Have you ever stopped short of total victory out of kindness or morality, only to regret it when that person recovered and attacked you again? Because if you have, you understand why Law 15 exists. If you haven't, you're either incredibly lucky, incredibly powerful, or you simply haven't faced serious enemies yet. But eventually, if you have ambitions, if you have success, if you have anything worth taking, you will face enemies. And how you handle them will determine whether you survive and thrive or whether you're destroyed by your own mercy. Let's start with the fundamental logic of why this law exists. When you're in conflict with someone, there are only a few possible outcomes. You can lose, which means they've crushed you. You can reach a stalemate, which means the conflict continues indefinitely. You can win partially, which means you've defeated them but they still have resources and capability to continue fighting. Or you can win totally, which means you've eliminated their ability to harm you. Of these four outcomes, only one actually ends the conflict: total victory. Everything else just pauses it or extends it. Think about what happens when you win partially. You've hurt your enemy. You've demonstrated that you can beat them. You've taken some of their resources or damaged their position. But you've left them alive, left them with some capability, left them with the memory of their defeat and the burning desire for revenge. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to lick their wounds, rebuild their strength, learn from their mistakes, and come back at you harder. Except now they're smarter because they learned from the first conflict. They're more determined because they're motivated by revenge. And they're more dangerous because they know your methods. You've essentially trained your enemy to be better at fighting you, then given them the opportunity to use that training against you. This is insane. It's strategically incompetent. It's like teaching someone how to defeat you, then expecting them not to use that knowledge. Yet people do this constantly. They defeat an enemy, then show mercy. They win a battle, then let their opponent go. They gain the upper hand, then ease up. And they pay for this mercy with their destruction later. Let me give you one of the most famous historical examples of this principle: the conflict between Carthage and Rome. In the First Punic War, Rome defeated Carthage but didn't crush them completely. They took some territory, imposed some penalties, but left Carthage with its wealth, its cities, its trade networks, and most importantly, its ability to rebuild. And what did Carthage do? They recovered. They rebuilt. They produced one of history's greatest military commanders, Hannibal Barca, who nearly destroyed Rome in the Second Punic War. For 15 years, Hannibal terrorized Rome, winning battle after battle, killing tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, devastating the Italian countryside. Rome came closer to total defeat than at almost any other point in its history. And why? Because they had shown mercy after the First Punic War. They had won but not crushed their enemy. They had left Carthage with the ability to recover and strike back. And Carthage did exactly that. Eventually, Rome defeated Carthage again in the Second Punic War. Did they make the same mistake twice? No. They had learned. They didn't just defeat Carthage this time. They didn't just take territory or impose penalties. They utterly destroyed Carthage. They burned the city to the ground. They sold the population into slavery. They salted the earth so nothing would grow there. They eliminated Carthage so completely that it could never threaten Rome again. And you know what? Carthage never did threaten Rome again. Because it no longer existed. This is brutal. This is harsh. This is difficult to stomach from a modern moral perspective. But it's also strategic genius. Rome's mistake was showing mercy the first time. Their wisdom was crushing their enemy totally the second time. The first approach nearly destroyed Rome. The second approach secured Rome's dominance in the Mediterranean for centuries. Which approach was actually more successful? Which approach actually ended the conflict and brought peace? The brutal one. The one that crushed the enemy totally. Now, I can already hear the objections. This is immoral. This is excessive. This is the thinking of tyrants and monsters. And there's truth to these concerns. This law can absolutely be abused. It can be used to justify cruelty that goes far beyond what's strategically necessary. It can become an excuse for eliminating anyone who opposes you in any way. This is the dark side of Law 15, and we need to address it directly. The key distinction is between crushing your enemy and being sadistically cruel. Crushing your enemy means eliminating their ability to harm you. It means making sure that when the conflict ends, it's truly over because they can no longer continue it. It doesn't necessarily mean killing them, though in historical warfare it often did. In modern contexts, crushing your enemy might mean destroying their business so completely they can never compete with you again. It might mean so thoroughly discrediting their reputation that they lose all credibility. It might mean legally and financially bankrupting them so they lack resources to attack you. It might mean politically destroying them so thoroughly they can never hold power again. But it doesn't mean torturing them for fun. It doesn't mean causing suffering beyond what's necessary to eliminate the threat. It doesn't mean attacking their family or innocent bystanders. It doesn't mean being cruel for cruelty's sake. The purpose is strategic, to end the conflict decisively. If cruelty serves no strategic purpose, it's just sadism wearing the costume of strategy. And sadism is both immoral and often counterproductive because it creates new enemies who want to avenge the excessive cruelty. So the question becomes, when is this law applicable, and when is it excessive? The answer depends on the nature of the conflict and the nature of the enemy. Not every opponent is an enemy who needs to be crushed. Not every conflict is a life-or-death struggle. Sometimes conflicts are minor, temporary, or resolvable through compromise. In these situations, crushing your opponent would be excessive and counterproductive. It would make you look like a monster and would create more problems than it solves. But there are enemies in conflicts where compromise is impossible, where mercy is suicide, where anything less than total victory guarantees your eventual destruction. How do you identify these situations? First, consider whether the enemy will accept defeat. Some people, when beaten, will acknowledge it and move on. Others will never accept defeat. They'll keep coming back no matter how many times you beat them. They'll dedicate their lives to revenge. These are the enemies who must be crushed totally because they'll never stop otherwise. Second, consider whether the enemy has the capability to recover. If you defeat someone who has no resources, no allies, no way to rebuild, they're already essentially crushed even if you show mercy. But if you defeat someone who has wealth, connections, skills, determination, they will rebuild unless you eliminate their capability to do so. The enemy with recovery capability must be crushed because they will recover if you don't. Third, consider whether the enemy is fundamentally opposed to your existence. Some conflicts are about specific issues where compromise is possible. But some enemies want you destroyed not because of what you've done but because of what you are. They oppose your very existence, your success, your position. With these enemies, there is no middle ground. Either they destroy you or you destroy them. These are the enemies who must be crushed totally because coexistence is impossible. Fourth, consider whether mercy would be interpreted as weakness. With some people, if you show mercy after defeating them, they'll respect you for it. With others, they'll interpret mercy as weakness and will attack you again because they think you're soft. These latter enemies must be crushed because mercy doesn't create gratitude in them, it creates contempt and renewed aggression. Let me give you a business example of someone who understood Law 15 perfectly. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into one of the most dominant companies in American history. How? Not by being nice to his competitors. Not by coexisting peacefully with rivals. He crushed them. When he entered a market, he would undercut competitors on price, selling at a loss if necessary because he had the resources to outlast them. He would buy up their supply sources and distribution channels. He would recruit away their best employees. He would spread rumors damaging their reputation. And when competitors were weakened but not destroyed, would he ease up? Would he show mercy? Never. He would buy them out at rock-bottom prices, absorbing their assets and eliminating them as competitors. Or if they wouldn't sell, he would keep up the pressure until they went bankrupt and disappeared entirely. He didn't defeat competitors, he annihilated them. He crushed them so thoroughly they could never recover and compete against him again. Was this ruthless? Absolutely. Was it strategic genius? Undeniably. Standard Oil dominated the oil industry so completely that it controlled over 90% of oil refining in America at its peak. How? Because Rockefeller understood that defeating a competitor halfway just means you'll have to fight them again. Better to crush them once and be done with it. Brutal, yes. But effective beyond question. Now, the government eventually broke up Standard Oil as a monopoly, which is a whole different issue about the limits of power and the dangers of becoming too dominant. But the principle Rockefeller demonstrated remains valid. In serious business competition, half measures don't work. If you're going to fight, fight to win completely. Otherwise, you're just creating future problems for yourself. Compare Rockefeller's approach to companies that defeat competitors but leave them alive and capable. What happens? The competitors recover, learn from their defeat, adapt their strategy, and come back stronger. You end up in perpetual conflict, constantly fighting the same enemies over and over. This is exhausting, expensive, and risky because eventually, one of those recurring conflicts might go against you. Whereas if you crush your enemy the first time, the conflict is over. You can move on to other things instead of constantly looking over your shoulder at the enemy you failed to finish off. Let's talk about this principle in political contexts, because this is where we see both the wisdom and the danger of Law 15 most clearly. Throughout history, political leaders who showed mercy to defeated enemies often regretted it. Julius Caesar famously showed mercy to many of his enemies in the Roman civil wars. He pardoned Brutus. He pardoned Cassius. He pardoned numerous others who had fought against him. He thought this mercy would win their loyalty and demonstrate his magnanimity. What happened? The very people he showed mercy to conspired to assassinate him. Brutus, whom Caesar had treated almost as a son, was one of the lead conspirators. They stabbed him to death in the Senate. Caesar's mercy bought him nothing but a violent death from the hands of his enemies. Had he been more ruthless, had he crushed his enemies rather than pardoning them, he would likely have lived longer and secured his position more firmly. Compare Caesar to his successor, Augustus. After defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, did Augustus show them mercy? No. They committed suicide, but if they hadn't, he would have killed them. He eliminated everyone who could possibly challenge his position. He was ruthless in crushing potential enemies. And what was the result? Augustus ruled for over 40 years, brought peace and stability to Rome, and established a dynasty. His ruthlessness in crushing his enemies secured decades of peace. Caesar's mercy brought chaos and civil war. Now, the dark side of this in politics is obvious. This is the logic that dictators use to justify purges, mass killings, political terror. Stalin used this logic when he eliminated anyone who could possibly threaten his power, killing millions. Mao used it during the Cultural Revolution. Hitler used it in his rise to power and his reign of terror. This is where Law 15 becomes monstrous. When it's applied not just to actual enemies who are trying to destroy you, but to anyone who might possibly oppose you, anyone who represents a potential future threat, anyone who belongs to a group you've decided is your enemy. This excessive application of Law 15 is both immoral and often strategically counterproductive. It creates so many new enemies, so much hatred, so much resistance, that it often ultimately leads to the dictator's downfall. The trick is knowing the difference between crushing actual enemies who are trying to destroy you, and paranoid purging of anyone who might possibly be a threat. One is strategic necessity. The other is tyrannical madness. In modern democratic politics, crushing your enemy rarely means killing them, thank God. But it still means eliminating their political power so completely they can't threaten you again. Think about political figures who've been so thoroughly destroyed by scandal, by election defeats, by loss of credibility, that they can never recover their position. They're crushed without being physically harmed. Their political power, which was the actual threat, has been eliminated. Now let's bring this into personal contexts, because most people reading this aren't Roman generals or business titans. How does Law 15 apply to ordinary people in ordinary conflicts? The answer is carefully and with great discernment. Most personal conflicts don't warrant crushing your enemy. Most interpersonal disputes are better resolved through communication, compromise, or simply walking away. But there are personal enemies who do need to be crushed, and failing to do so can ruin your life. Think about someone who's harassing you, who's stalking you, who's spreading vicious lies about you, who's trying to destroy your reputation or your livelihood. If you respond weakly or show mercy, do they stop? Usually not. They interpret your mercy as weakness and escalate their attacks. These are the personal enemies who must be crushed. You need to eliminate their ability to harm you through whatever legal means are available. Restraining orders, lawsuits, criminal charges, exposing their lies publicly, getting them fired if they're using workplace access to harm you, whatever it takes within legal bounds to make it impossible for them to continue their attacks. I knew someone once who had a coworker who was spreading malicious lies about them, sabotaging their work, trying to get them fired. This person tried taking the high road. They tried reasoning with the coworker. They tried appealing to their humanity. They tried going through normal workplace channels to resolve the conflict. None of it worked. The coworker kept attacking, kept lying, kept sabotaging. The situation kept getting worse. Finally, this person realized they were in a serious conflict that required serious measures. They documented everything. They gathered evidence of the coworker's lies and sabotage. They built an airtight case. And then they went to leadership not to complain, but to present overwhelming evidence that this coworker was damaging the organization. The result? The coworker was fired. Their reputation was destroyed. They couldn't get a good reference. They struggled to find employment in that industry afterward. They were crushed. Was this harsh? Yes. But was it necessary? Absolutely. Because this coworker wasn't going to stop. They weren't going to respond to reason or mercy. They were dedicated to destroying my acquaintance. The only solution was to eliminate their ability to continue the attack. And once they were fired and their reputation destroyed in the industry, they lost that ability. The conflict ended. Not because they became reasonable, but because they were crushed. Compare that to another person I knew in a similar situation who kept taking the high road, kept showing mercy, kept trying to be the bigger person. What happened? The enemy wore them down. The constant attacks eventually succeeded. They got fired based on the accumulation of lies. Their reputation was damaged. Their career was set back years. Their mercy to their enemy achieved nothing except their own destruction. They lost because they didn't understand Law 15. They thought being kind and forgiving would work. It didn't. It never does with truly malicious enemies. Now let's talk about the opposite error, crushing people who aren't actually your enemies, or crushing minor opponents when it's unnecessary and excessive. This is where people misapply Law 15 and create disaster for themselves. Someone disagrees with you in a meeting, and you try to get them fired. Someone competes with you for a promotion, and you spread lies about them. Someone criticizes you, and you launch a campaign to destroy their reputation. This is excessive, and it makes you the villain. The difference is this: an enemy is someone who's actively trying to harm you, who won't stop unless forced to, who represents a genuine threat to something important. A competitor or critic or person who disagrees with you isn't necessarily an enemy. They might become one if you treat them like one, but initially, they're just someone with different interests or opinions. Crushing these people is not only morally wrong, it's strategically stupid because it makes you look like a tyrant and it creates real enemies where none existed before. The wisdom is in distinguishing between enemies who must be crushed and everyone else who can be dealt with through normal means. Not everyone who opposes you is your enemy. Not every conflict requires total war. The person who treats every disagreement as a life-or-death battle, who tries to crush everyone who gets in their way, that person becomes known as unstable and dangerous. They create so many enemies that they're eventually destroyed by the coalition of people they unnecessarily crushed. So how do you know when to apply Law 15 and when to show restraint? First, assess whether the person is truly your enemy or just someone with different interests. An enemy actively wants to harm you. Someone with different interests just wants different outcomes. These are not the same. Trying to crush someone with different interests is excessive and will backfire. Second, assess whether the conflict is resolvable through compromise. If both parties can get something they want through negotiation, that's not a situation for crushing anyone. But if the conflict is zero-sum, where one person's victory requires the other's defeat, and if compromise is impossible, then you're in a situation where Law 15 might apply. Third, assess whether the person will stop if defeated or continue if given the chance. Someone who, when beaten, acknowledges defeat and moves on, doesn't need to be crushed. Someone who, when beaten, immediately starts planning their comeback, does need to be crushed because they won't stop otherwise. Fourth, assess the cost-benefit of crushing versus showing mercy. Sometimes crushing an enemy creates so many new problems, so many new enemies, that it's not worth it even if strategically possible. But sometimes showing mercy guarantees future attacks that will cost more than crushing them would have. Fifth, assess whether you have the capability to actually crush them. If you can't fully defeat them, then attacking them at all might be a mistake. Better to avoid conflict with an enemy you can't crush than to half defeat them and face their revenge later. Only engage in conflicts you can win decisively. Let me share a story about someone who applied Law 15 with perfect calibration. There was an executive at a tech company who had a colleague actively sabotaging her projects, stealing credit for her work, and undermining her with leadership. This colleague was genuinely her enemy, not just a competitor. The attacks were deliberate and malicious. And the colleague was politically skilled, so fighting back openly would be risky. What did this executive do? She didn't immediately attack. She didn't try to crush her enemy prematurely when she lacked the power to do so. Instead, she built her own position. She delivered excellent results. She cultivated relationships with key decision-makers. She documented every instance of the colleague's sabotage. She patiently built an overwhelming case while simultaneously making herself valuable and trusted. Then, when the time was right, when she had the political capital and the evidence, she made her move. She didn't just complain about the colleague. She presented leadership with evidence that this person was actively damaging the company, that they couldn't be trusted, that they were a liability. And she had a solution ready. She was prepared to take on the additional responsibilities if this person was removed. The colleague was fired. Their reputation in the industry was destroyed because the reasons for their firing became known through unofficial channels. They struggled to find comparable employment afterward. They were crushed. And the executive who crushed them went on to a very successful career, never facing another serious internal enemy because everyone saw what happened to the last person who tried to destroy her. This is Law 15 applied with intelligence. She didn't crush someone unnecessarily. She identified a genuine enemy. She waited until she had the power to crush them completely. She executed decisively. And she ensured they couldn't recover and attack her again. The result was a permanent end to that conflict and a deterrent effect that prevented future enemies. Now let's talk about the psychological dimension of why people fail to crush their enemies even when they should. The first reason is misplaced empathy. When you've defeated someone, when they're vulnerable and helpless, it's natural to feel sympathy for them. They're suffering. They're beaten. Kicking them while they're down feels wrong. This emotional response is understandable, but in serious conflicts, it's dangerous. You have to remember that this person, if given the chance, would destroy you without hesitation. They've already tried to harm you. That's why you're in conflict with them in the first place. Your empathy for them should not blind you to the threat they represent. If you let them recover, they will attack you again. Your mercy achieves nothing except guaranteeing future attacks. The second reason is fear of being seen as ruthless or cruel. We want to be liked. We want to be seen as good people. Crushing an enemy, even when strategic, makes us look bad to observers who don't understand the full context. They see you destroying someone and think you're cruel. This social pressure causes many people to show mercy even when it's strategically foolish. The solution is to not care what people who don't understand the situation think. The people who matter, who know the full context, will understand why you had to crush your enemy. The people who judge you without understanding the situation, their opinion isn't worth sacrificing your security for. You can't make everyone like you, and trying to do so makes you weak and vulnerable. The third reason is the belief that mercy will be reciprocated. We think if we show mercy to our defeated enemy, they'll be grateful and won't attack us again. This is naive. In some cultures and some contexts, mercy does create obligation and gratitude. But with genuinely dangerous enemies, mercy is usually interpreted as weakness. They don't become loyal because you spared them. They become contemptuous because you were too weak to finish them off. And they attack again as soon as they're able. The fourth reason is simple exhaustion. Crushing an enemy completely takes time, effort, and resources. When you've already defeated them once, you're tired. You want the conflict to be over. You want to move on to other things. So you stop short of total victory, thinking the enemy is defeated enough. But they're not. They recover while you're focused elsewhere. And then they attack when you're not ready. The solution is to finish what you start. Yes, it takes more effort to crush an enemy totally than to defeat them partially. But it takes far less effort than fighting the same enemy multiple times. Invest the effort up front to end the conflict permanently, and you'll save yourself endless trouble later. Now let's talk about specific tactics for crushing enemies in modern contexts. In business, crushing a competitor means eliminating their ability to compete. This might mean undercutting their prices until they go bankrupt. It might mean buying up their suppliers or distribution channels. It might mean recruiting away their key employees. It might mean acquiring them and shutting them down. It might mean out-innovating them so thoroughly that customers see them as obsolete. The goal is to make it impossible for them to compete with you anymore. In professional contexts, crushing an enemy might mean destroying their reputation so thoroughly they can't work in that industry anymore. It might mean getting them fired and ensuring they can't get hired elsewhere by making their misconduct known. It might mean legally exposing their wrongdoing so they face consequences that eliminate them as a threat. It might mean building such an overwhelming case against them that they're forced to leave the field entirely. In personal contexts, crushing an enemy might mean getting restraining orders that legally prevent them from contacting you. It might mean pursuing legal action that bankrupts them. It might mean exposing their lies and wrongdoing so completely that nobody believes them anymore. It might mean getting them excluded from social circles you share so they can't access you anymore. The goal is always the same: eliminate their ability to harm you. But in all these contexts, you must operate within legal and ethical bounds. Crushing your enemy doesn't mean breaking the law. It doesn't mean lying or fabricating evidence. It doesn't mean violence or threats. You can crush someone completely using only legal and ethical means if you're strategic about it. In fact, staying within legal and ethical bounds protects you from becoming vulnerable yourself through illegal actions. Let's address the question of forgiveness and whether it contradicts Law 15. Forgiveness is often presented as the highest virtue, the most evolved response to being wronged. And there's psychological value in forgiveness for your own peace of mind. Holding grudges and living in hatred is corrosive to your own well-being. But here's the key distinction: you can forgive someone emotionally while still ensuring they can't harm you again. Forgiveness is an internal psychological state. It's about letting go of hatred and desire for revenge, which poison you more than they harm your enemy. But forgiveness doesn't mean trusting someone who's betrayed you. It doesn't mean giving them another chance to harm you. It doesn't mean leaving them with the ability to attack you again. You can forgive your enemy while still crushing their ability to harm you. These are not contradictory. Think of it this way: if someone breaks into your home and attacks you, you might eventually forgive them for your own peace of mind. But that doesn't mean you leave your door unlocked so they can attack you again. You still lock your doors. You still take security measures. You still ensure they can't harm you again. Forgiveness is internal. Protection is external. You need both. Some of the wisest and most powerful people in history have understood this distinction. They didn't carry personal hatred for their enemies, which would have clouded their judgment. But they absolutely crushed those enemies to ensure they couldn't pose further threats. The lack of personal hatred made them more effective at crushing their enemies, not less, because they could act strategically rather than emotionally. Now let's talk about the long-term consequences of crushing your enemies versus showing mercy. In the short term, crushing your enemies looks harsh and mercy looks noble. But in the long term, the outcome's reverse. The person who crushes their enemies has fewer conflicts over time because enemies have been eliminated and potential enemies have been deterred. The conflicts they do have end decisively and permanently. They can focus on building and creating rather than constantly defending against recurring enemies. The person who shows mercy to enemies has more conflicts over time because enemies keep coming back. The same conflicts recur repeatedly. They spend enormous energy on defense and conflict management. They're constantly looking over their shoulder, constantly vulnerable to attacks from enemies they failed to finish off. Their mercy creates perpetual insecurity. Which life is actually better? Which approach actually leads to more peace in the long run? Counterintuitively, the ruthless approach of crushing enemies leads to more long-term peace because conflicts actually end. The merciful approach leads to perpetual low-level warfare because conflicts never truly end. This is why successful people and organizations often seem ruthless. It's not that they're cruel by nature. It's that they've learned through experience that half measures in serious conflicts don't work. They've learned that crushing your enemy, while harsh, actually creates more peace and stability in the long run than showing mercy that gets exploited. Think about countries that have achieved long-term peace and stability. Often, it's because at some point, they crushed their enemies so thoroughly that serious challenges to their power became impossible. The Pax Romana lasted for centuries partly because Rome had crushed its major enemies and established such overwhelming dominance that challenging them became unthinkable. The Pax Britannica existed for similar reasons. The post-World War II American-led order has lasted as long as it has partly because the Axis powers were crushed so thoroughly in World War II that they were forced to become allies rather than enemies. Compare that to situations where enemies were defeated but not crushed, where conflicts were resolved through compromise rather than total victory. These situations often see the conflict reignite years or decades later. The Middle East is full of conflicts that keep recurring because no side has crushed the other thoroughly enough to end the conflict permanently. The Koreas are still technically at war 70 years after the Korean War ended in stalemate rather than decisive victory. These ongoing conflicts cause far more suffering over time than crushing one side would have caused. Now, I want to address the spiritual and moral objections to Law 15 because they're significant and deserve serious consideration. Many religious and ethical traditions emphasize forgiveness, mercy, turning the other cheek, not repaying evil with evil. These are profound moral teachings from traditions with thousands of years of wisdom. How do we reconcile them with Law 15? The first point is that spiritual teachings are often aimed at personal spiritual development rather than strategic success in worldly affairs. When Jesus taught about turning the other cheek, he was teaching about spiritual liberation from cycles of revenge, not teaching political or military strategy. When Buddha taught about not harboring hatred, he was teaching about achieving inner peace, not teaching how to win conflicts. These teachings are valuable for their intended purpose, but applying them as strategic advice in serious conflicts can be catastrophic. The second point is that even within these traditions, there's recognition that different contexts require different responses. The same religious traditions that teach forgiveness also teach about just war, about protecting the innocent, about resisting evil. There's recognition that while forgiveness might be the ideal response to personal slights, protecting yourself and others from dangerous enemies might require force and decisive action. The third point is that showing mercy to a dangerous enemy might actually be immoral if it allows that enemy to harm others. If you defeat someone who's evil and harmful, then show them mercy, and they go on to harm innocent people, aren't you partly responsible for that harm? Your mercy enabled it. Sometimes crushing an enemy is actually the more moral choice because it prevents future harm to innocents. The fourth point is that you can distinguish between personal forgiveness and strategic action. You can forgive your enemy in your heart while still taking action to ensure they can't harm anyone again. Internal forgiveness for your own peace doesn't require external mercy that creates danger. Let me share one final story that brings together all these themes. There was an entrepreneur who built a successful company. A former partner, who had left the company years earlier on bad terms, started a competing company. This former partner didn't just compete legitimately. They stole trade secrets. They poached employees using illegal means. They spread lies about the original company. They were clearly an enemy, not just a competitor. The entrepreneur had a choice. They could take legal action but settle for minor remedies that would slow down the former partner but not stop them. Or they could pursue total legal warfare with the goal of completely destroying the former partner's company and reputation. The first approach felt less harsh, more measured. The second felt ruthless and excessive. The entrepreneur initially chose the measured approach. They sued for specific damages. They won some concessions. But the former partner continued their attacks in new forms. The conflict dragged on for years, costing enormous money and energy. Finally, the entrepreneur realized they had violated Law 15. They had wounded their enemy but not crushed them. And the wounded enemy had kept fighting. So they shifted strategy. They pursued total legal warfare. They didn't just sue for damages, they sued to destroy. They exposed every bit of wrongdoing. They pursued criminal charges where applicable. They made sure every potential customer, employee, and investor knew about the former partner's misconduct. They didn't stop until the former partner's company collapsed and their reputation was destroyed beyond recovery. Was this harsh? Yes. But did it work? Absolutely. The conflict ended. The former partner was crushed and couldn't continue the attacks. And the entrepreneur could finally focus on building their company rather than constantly defending against attacks. The years spent in measured, merciful conflict had been wasted. The decisive crushing action, while harsher, actually resolved the situation and allowed everyone to move on. the entrepreneur later reflected that they should have crushed their enemy immediately when the first attacks occurred. By trying to be measured and merciful, they had just prolonged the conflict and increased the total suffering for everyone involved. The truly kind approach, counterintuitively, would have been to crush the enemy quickly and decisively, ending the conflict immediately rather than letting it drag on for years. So where does this leave us? What's the wisdom of Law 15 for people who want to be both strategic and ethical? First, avoid creating enemies unnecessarily. Most conflicts don't need to escalate to the point where crushing anyone is necessary. Be strategic about which battles you fight. Don't make enemies out of everyone who disagrees with you or competes with you. Second, when you do have genuine enemies who are trying to destroy you, recognize them for what they are. Don't pretend they're just competitors or critics if they're actually enemies. Don't be naive about their intentions. Third, if you must fight an enemy, commit to winning decisively. Don't half fight. Don't wound them and leave them capable of recovery. Either crush them or don't fight at all. Half measures just create more problems. Fourth, operate within legal and ethical bounds. You can crush enemies without breaking laws or doing things you'll be ashamed of later. Strategic ruthlessness doesn't require immorality. Fifth, distinguish between crushing your enemy and being unnecessarily cruel. The goal is to eliminate their ability to harm you, not to cause suffering for its own sake. Any cruelty beyond what's strategically necessary is both immoral and often counterproductive because it creates sympathy for your enemy and new enemies who oppose your excessive cruelty. Sixth, recognize that crushing your enemy is a last resort for serious conflicts, not a first response to every challenge. Save this approach for genuine enemies who won't stop otherwise. Use it rarely, but when you use it decisively. Seventh, understand that in the long run, decisively ending conflicts by crushing enemies actually creates more peace than showing mercy that allows conflicts to continue indefinitely. The harsh approach, paradoxically, is often the more peaceful approach over time. Now let's explore some common mistakes people make when they do try to apply Law 15. The first mistake is attacking prematurely before you have the power to actually crush your enemy. This is catastrophic. If you attack an enemy but lack the capability to finish them, you've just revealed your hostility while leaving them capable of fighting back. You've turned a potential enemy into an active enemy, you've shown them you're dangerous, but you haven't eliminated them. Now they'll come at you with everything they have, and you're not ready. The wisdom is to wait until you have overwhelming force before you move. Build your position. Accumulate resources. Cultivate allies. Gather intelligence. And only when you're certain you can crush your enemy completely do you make your move. Patience is critical here. Many people lose conflicts not because they weren't ruthless enough, but because they were ruthless too soon, before they had the power to make it work. Think about military strategy. No competent general attacks without ensuring they have the forces necessary to win decisively. They wait, they build up, they prepare, and only then do they attack. The same principle applies to any serious conflict. You attack when you can win, not before. And in the context of Law 15, you only attack when you can crush your enemy, not when you can only wound them. The second mistake is stopping short of total victory out of exhaustion or overconfidence. You've beaten your enemy. They're weakened. You're tired from the conflict. You think the job is done. So you stop pushing. This is exactly when you need to push hardest. This is when your enemy is most vulnerable and can be crushed with one final push. But instead, you rest. And they recover. And you have to fight them all over again. The marathon runner doesn't stop at mile 25 of a 26-mile race. They push through the final mile even though they're exhausted. Because stopping just before the finish line means you don't actually finish the race. The same is true in conflicts. Push through to total victory even when you're tired. Finish what you started. Complete the crushing of your enemy even when you'd rather just declare victory and move on. The third mistake is being inconsistent in your approach. You crush one enemy totally, but then show mercy to another similar enemy. This inconsistency confuses people and undermines the deterrent effect. Potential enemies don't know whether you'll crush them or show mercy, so they might risk attacking you thinking you'll be merciful. And current enemies don't know how seriously to take your threats. The wisdom is to be consistent in your approach. If you've established that you crush enemies who cross certain lines, then you must crush every enemy who crosses those lines. This consistency creates clarity and deterrence. People know exactly what will happen if they become your enemy. This predictable ruthlessness prevents many conflicts from starting in the first place because potential enemies know they'll be crushed if they attack you. The fourth mistake is failing to finish the job by leaving your enemy with resources or capabilities you overlooked. You destroy their business but leave them with industry connections they can use to start a new competing business. You discredit them publicly but leave them with allies who will help them rebuild. You defeat them in one arena but ignore their strength in another arena they can use against you. This incomplete crushing allows them to recover using the resources you failed to eliminate. The wisdom is to be thorough. When you're crushing an enemy, make a complete inventory of their resources and capabilities. Eliminate all of them, not just the most obvious ones. Cut off their money, their allies, their reputation, their access to information, their ability to rebuild in any domain where they might pose a future threat. Thoroughness is what makes crushing complete rather than partial. The fifth mistake is crushing your enemy publicly in ways that create martyrs or sympathy figures. If people see you crushing someone they perceive as weak or sympathetic, they turn against you even if that person was genuinely your enemy who deserved to be crushed. You win the battle but lose public support, creating new enemies in the process. The wisdom is to crush your enemies in ways that don't create public sympathy for them. This might mean exposing their wrongdoing before you crush them, so people understand why they deserved it. It might mean crushing them quietly rather than publicly, so there's no drama for people to get emotional about. It might mean framing your actions as justice or necessity rather than revenge or cruelty. The goal is to eliminate your enemy while maintaining public support or at least public indifference. Let's talk about the psychology of enemies and why some people keep coming back no matter how many times you defeat them. Understanding this psychology is critical to knowing when crushing is necessary. Some people have personality types that simply cannot accept defeat. They're narcissists who cannot acknowledge being beaten. They're obsessives who fixate on revenge. They're true believers who see you as evil incarnate and feel morally obligated to destroy you. These personality types will never stop coming after you unless you crush them completely. How do you identify these types? They show a pattern of never letting things go. If you look at their history, they have multiple long-running feuds and vendettas. They talk obsessively about people who wronged them years or decades ago. They frame everything in terms of absolute good and evil with themselves as the righteous victims. They cannot see nuance or accept partial responsibility for conflicts. These are warning signs that you're dealing with someone who will never stop unless crushed. With these personality types, showing mercy is not just strategically foolish, it's psychologically naive. You're expecting them to respond rationally to your mercy, but they're not rational. You're expecting them to feel gratitude, but they're not capable of it. You're expecting them to accept defeat, but their psychology won't allow it. The only solution with these types is crushing them so completely they lack any capability to continue the fight, because they lack the psychological capacity to choose to stop. Now let's address the situation where you've crushed an enemy but they somehow manage to recover and come back at you anyway. This happens sometimes despite your best efforts. Maybe they had hidden resources you didn't know about. Maybe they got help from allies you weren't aware of. Maybe they're more resilient than you anticipated. What do? The answer is simple: crush them again, but more thoroughly this time. Learn from whatever you missed the first time. Identify how they recovered and eliminate those resources or capabilities this time. And crush them even more completely than before. Show them and everyone else that coming back after being crushed once only results in being crushed more thoroughly the second time. This demonstration has powerful deterrent effects on both the current enemy and potential future enemies. There's a principle in learning theory called overlearning, where you practice something beyond the point of initial mastery to ensure deep retention. Apply this to crushing enemies. Don't just crush them to the point where they seem unable to recover. Crush them beyond that point. Eliminate resources and capabilities they don't currently need but might use to recover. Make recovery impossible, not just difficult. This overcrush approach ensures that even if you missed something or they get lucky, they still can't recover. Let's discuss the role of allies in crushing enemies. You rarely crush a powerful enemy alone. You need allies who support your efforts, who add their resources to yours, who legitimize your actions. Building the right alliances before you move against an enemy is often what determines success or failure. With strong allies, you can crush enemies you couldn't touch alone. Without allies, you might lack the power to crush even relatively weak enemies. How do you build these alliances? First, identify people who also have reason to want your enemy crushed. Your enemy probably has other enemies. Form common cause with them. Second, make it in people's interests to help you. Offer something valuable in exchange for their support in crushing your enemy. Third, frame the crushing of your enemy as serving the common good. Show how your enemy threatens not just you but others as well. Make crushing them seem like a public service. The most effective enemy crushing campaigns are often coalitions where multiple parties unite to eliminate a common threat. No one party might have the power to crush the enemy alone, but together they overwhelm them. This is why building alliances is so critical before you engage in serious conflicts. The enemy you can't crush alone might be easily crushed with allies. Now let's talk about the aftermath of crushing an enemy. What do you do once it's done? First, you monitor to ensure they stay crushed. Sometimes enemies find unexpected resources or allies and attempt comebacks. You need to watch for this and be prepared to crush them again if necessary. Don't assume that because you crushed them once, they're finished forever. Stay vigilant. Second, you use the example as a deterrent to potential future enemies. Make sure people know what happened to your previous enemy. Not in a gloating way that makes you look cruel, but in a matter-of-fact way that establishes consequences. Let it be known that people who become your enemies get crushed. This prevents many potential conflicts from starting because people understand the price of becoming your enemy. Third, you move on without dwelling on it. Once an enemy is crushed, they're no longer relevant. Don't keep talking about them. Don't keep thinking about them. They're finished. Focus your attention and energy on building and creating rather than on past conflicts. The point of crushing enemies is to eliminate threats so you can focus on more productive things. Don't let past conflicts occupy mental space once they're resolved. Fourth, you learn from the experience. What worked in crushing this enemy? What mistakes did you make? How could you have crushed them more efficiently or with less collateral damage? Every conflict is a learning opportunity. Extract the lessons so you're more effective in future conflicts if they arise. Let's explore the relationship between Law 15 and reputation. Crushing enemies affects how people see you. Done right, it creates a reputation for being strong, decisive, not to be trifled with. This reputation itself becomes a form of power because it deters potential enemies. People think twice before crossing someone with a reputation for crushing their enemies. But done wrong, crushing enemies can create a reputation for being cruel, excessive, unstable, or villainous. This reputation attracts enemies rather than deterring them because people see you as a threat who must be stopped. It also makes it hard to find allies because people don't want to associate with someone they see as cruel or evil. The key is to crush enemies in ways that create the right kind of reputation. You want to be seen as strong but not cruel, as decisive but not capricious, as someone who responds proportionally to genuine threats but doesn't attack people unnecessarily. This reputation requires careful management of how you crush enemies. You need to ensure people understand why the enemy needed to be crushed, that the enemy was genuinely dangerous, that your response was proportional even if total. This often means exposing your enemy's wrongdoing before or while you crush them. Show people what they did that made crushing necessary. This frames your actions as justice or necessary self-defense rather than unprovoked cruelty. It also prevents your enemy from gaining sympathy by portraying themselves as innocent victims of your cruelty. Now let's address a critical question. What if you're on the receiving end of someone trying to crush you? What if you're the enemy being crushed? How do you survive? This is important because Law 15 works in both directions. Your enemies might understand this law and attempt to crush you. You need to know how to defend against it. The first defense is to never let conflicts escalate to the point where someone is trying to crush you. Avoid making powerful enemies. Don't give people reasons to want to destroy you. Be strategic about which conflicts you engage in. Many people end up being crushed because they unnecessarily made enemies of powerful people. The second defense is to recognize when someone is trying to crush you and respond before they succeed. If you see someone systematically attacking your resources, your reputation, your capabilities, they're probably trying to crush you. Don't wait until you're fully crushed to respond. Counterattack or escape while you still have resources and capabilities. The third defense is to become too costly to crush. If crushing you would cost your enemy more than leaving you alone, they might choose to leave you alone. This might mean having powerful allies who would retaliate if you were crushed. It might mean having information that would be released if you were destroyed. It might mean having capabilities that your enemy needs and would lose if you were crushed. Make yourself valuable or dangerous enough that crushing you isn't worth the cost. The fourth defense is to make yourself uncrushable by not having a single point of failure. Diversify your resources, your reputation, your capabilities across multiple domains. If your enemy crushes you in one area, you still have strength in other areas. This resilience through diversification makes total crushing nearly impossible. Your enemy might defeat you in one arena, but you survive and continue in others. The fifth defense is to escape if you realize you're being crushed and cannot successfully defend. Sometimes the wisest choice is to withdraw from the conflict entirely, to start over somewhere else, to rebuild outside your enemy's reach. This isn't defeat, it's strategic retreat. You survive, which means you can potentially come back later when circumstances are more favorable. Let's talk about some specific historical examples where leaders survived attempts to crush them. Churchill was politically crushed multiple times in his career. His political enemies destroyed his reputation and drove him from power. But he survived by maintaining his capabilities through writing and speaking. He rebuilt his reputation. And when circumstances changed and Britain needed him in World War II, he returned to power. His enemies had crushed him politically but hadn't eliminated his capabilities completely, which allowed his eventual comeback. Richard Nixon was crushed by Watergate. He resigned in disgrace. His political career was over. His reputation was destroyed. But he survived physically and financially. And over subsequent decades, he rebuilt a portion of his reputation as an elder statesman and foreign policy expert. He could never return to power, but he wasn't completely eliminated. He maintained some influence through his expertise and connections. These examples show that even being crushed doesn't necessarily mean complete elimination. If you maintain some capabilities, some resources, some reputation, you can potentially rebuild. This is why truly crushing an enemy means eliminating all of these things, not just defeating them in one domain. Now let's discuss the modern corporate context where Law 15 plays out constantly. Companies crush competitors regularly. Microsoft famously crushed Netscape by bundling Internet Explorer with Windows. This was so effective at eliminating the competitor that Microsoft faced antitrust prosecution. But from Microsoft's strategic perspective, they successfully crushed an enemy that threatened their dominance. The legal consequences were a cost of that crushing, but they eliminated the competitive threat. Amazon has crushed numerous competitors by using their resources to undercut prices, acquire companies, or out-innovate competitors until those competitors disappeared. They don't just compete, they crush. This ruthless approach has made them one of the most dominant companies in history. But it's also made them the target of antitrust actions and public criticism. This is the double-edged nature of crushing enemies in modern contexts. It's effective, but it creates new problems. Facebook crushed MySpace so thoroughly that MySpace went from social media dominance to irrelevance in just a few years. How? By being better, yes, but also by ensuring MySpace couldn't recover. They attracted away MySpace's users by being more appealing. They recruited away their talent. They out-innovated them. They made MySpace obsolete. This is corporate crushing. And it's remarkably effective. MySpace never recovered and isn't even a memory for most internet users today. The lesson for businesses is clear: if you're in serious competition with another company, competing isn't enough. You need to think about how to crush them, how to eliminate them as competitors permanently. This might sound harsh, but it's the reality of business at the highest levels. Companies that think only about competing rather than crushing often end up crushed by competitors who understand Law 15 better. Let's explore the ethical boundaries around crushing enemies in business. There are legal limits on anti-competitive behavior. You can't collude with others to crush competitors. You can't use illegal tactics. You can't abuse monopoly power once you have it. These legal limits exist to protect competition and prevent excessive crushing that harms consumers and society. Within these legal limits, though, crushing competitors is not only legal but expected. You're supposed to try to win market share. You're supposed to try to make competitors obsolete. You're supposed to try to become dominant. As long as you do it through better products, better service, better prices, better innovation, it's not only legal but socially beneficial. You're improving the market by crushing inferior competitors. The line is between crushing competitors through superior performance versus crushing them through illegal means like sabotage, collusion, fraud, or abuse of monopoly power. The first is good business. The second is illegal and unethical. Understanding this line is critical for applying Law 15 in business contexts. Now let's talk about the personal cost of crushing enemies. It's not free psychologically or morally. When you crush someone, even when it's strategically necessary, even when they deserve it, it takes a toll on you. You have to live with having destroyed someone. You have to live with being the kind of person who's capable of ruthlessness. This is not trivial. Some people handle this psychological burden easily. They compartmentalize. They rationalize. They focus on necessity and don't dwell on the human cost. Other people struggle with it. They feel guilt, regret, or moral conflict even when they intellectually understand their actions were necessary. There's no easy answer to managing this psychological cost. It's part of the price of power and survival in serious conflicts. The healthiest approach is probably honest acknowledgement. Yes, you crushed your enemy. Yes, you destroyed someone. No, it doesn't feel good, and it shouldn't feel good. But it was necessary for your survival or for protecting others. You accept responsibility for your actions and their consequences. You don't pretend it was fun or easy or morally simple. You did something hard and costly because it was necessary. This honest accounting allows you to maintain your humanity while doing what strategic necessity required. Let's discuss the relationship between crushing enemies and prevention of future conflicts. One argument for Law 15 is that thoroughly crushing enemies now prevents more conflicts and more suffering in the future. If you crush an enemy completely, that conflict is over forever. No more battles. No more casualties. No more resources wasted on recurring conflict. In this view, the harsh approach of crushing is actually the merciful approach long-term because it minimizes total suffering. Compare that to showing mercy and having the conflict recur repeatedly over years or decades. Each recurrence causes more suffering, more casualties, more waste. The total suffering over time exceeds what would have resulted from crushing the enemy initially. In this view, mercy that allows conflicts to continue is actually the cruel approach because it perpetuates suffering. This is a utilitarian argument: crush enemies to minimize total long-term suffering, even if it requires more immediate harsh action. It's a controversial view, but it has logical merit. The question is whether you accept the moral framework that minimizing total suffering justifies harsh immediate action. Different ethical systems answer this differently. Now let's talk about the situations where Law 15 absolutely does not apply and using it would be catastrophic. First, family conflicts rarely warrant crushing anyone. Unless you're dealing with genuinely abusive or dangerous family members, crushing family enemies just creates permanent family ruptures that harm everyone. Most family conflicts are better resolved through boundaries, communication, or if necessary, limiting contact, not through crushing. Second, minor conflicts with colleagues or neighbors don't warrant crushing. These are people you have to interact with regularly. Crushing them creates ongoing difficulties in your daily life. Better to resolve minor conflicts through compromise, avoidance, or if necessary, changing jobs or moving. Save crushing for serious enemies, not for people who annoy you. Third, conflicts with institutions or governments rarely warrant individual crushing attempts. These entities are too powerful for individuals to crush. Trying to crush a government or major institution as an individual just gets you destroyed. Better to work within the system, organize collective action, or move to a different jurisdiction. Don't try to crush enemies you have no chance of crushing. Fourth, ideological or philosophical disagreements don't warrant crushing. Someone who disagrees with your political views, your religious beliefs, your philosophical positions, they're not your enemy. They're just someone with different views. Trying to crush everyone who disagrees with you is tyrannical and creates far more enemies than it eliminates. Intellectual diversity is healthy. Save crushing for actual threats, not different opinions. Fifth, competitive situations with clear rules and structures rarely warrant crushing. Sports competitions, academic competitions, fair business competitions, these have structures that limit conflict and provide clear resolutions. Trying to crush opponents in these contexts by going outside the rules makes you a cheater and a villain. Compete within the rules. Save crushing for conflicts without rules where survival is at stake. So let me synthesize all of this into practical wisdom you can actually use. Law 15, crush your enemy totally, is one of the most powerful and dangerous laws of power. Used correctly, it ends conflicts decisively and creates long-term security. Used incorrectly, it makes you a tyrant and creates more enemies than it eliminates. The key is knowing when to apply it and when to use other approaches. Apply Law 15 when you face genuine enemies who are trying to destroy you and won't stop unless you crush them. When the conflict is serious enough that your livelihood, your safety, or something truly important is at stake. When you have the capability to actually crush your enemy completely. When the costs of crushing are less than the costs of ongoing conflict. In these situations, commit fully. Crush your enemy so thoroughly they cannot recover and threaten you again. Do not apply Law 15 to minor conflicts, to people who aren't actually your enemies, to situations where compromise is possible, to opponents you lack the power to crush, or to contexts where crushing would create more problems than it solves. In these situations, use other approaches. Compromise, coexistence, avoidance, or simply competing fairly within established rules. When you do apply Law 15, do it within legal and ethical bounds. Be thorough. Don't stop short of total victory. Don't leave your enemy with resources or capabilities to recover. But also don't be cruel beyond what's strategically necessary. The goal is to eliminate the threat, not to cause suffering for its own sake. After you crush an enemy, monitor to ensure they stay crushed. Use the example as a deterrent to future potential enemies. Learn from the experience. And then move on. Don't dwell on past conflicts once they're resolved. Focus your energy on building and creating rather than on conquered enemies. If you're on the receiving end of someone trying to crush you, recognize it early and respond before they succeed. Make yourself too costly or too difficult to crush. Diversify so you don't have a single point of failure. And if necessary, escape to fight another day rather than being destroyed completely. Understand that crushing enemies has psychological and moral costs. Accept these costs honestly rather than pretending they don't exist. You're capable of ruthlessness when necessary, and that's a form of strength. But it should never be something you enjoy or take lightly. The capacity for ruthlessness should be balanced by a strong moral compass that ensures you only use it when truly necessary. So I'll leave you with these final questions to reflect on deeply. Who are your real enemies versus who are merely competitors or critics? Do you have enemies you've defeated partially who might recover and attack you again? If so, Should you finish the job and crush them now, or can you safely coexist? Are there conflicts in your life that need decisive ending rather than ongoing management? Do you have the capability to crush your enemies if necessary, or do you need to build more power first? And perhaps most importantly, are you capable of the ruthlessness that crushing enemies requires, while maintaining the moral center that ensures you only use that ruthlessness when necessary? Because Law 15 requires both. Ruthlessness without morality makes you a monster. Morality without the capacity for ruthlessness makes you a victim. The wise person has both, the moral judgment to know when crushing is necessary and when it's excessive, and the capability to crush decisively when the situation demands it. This is Law 15. Crush your enemy totally. Not out of cruelty, but out of strategic necessity. Not to everyone who opposes you, but to genuine enemies who won't stop until one of you is destroyed. Not gleefully, but soberly, understanding the costs and accepting the responsibility. Do this when necessary, and you eliminate threats permanently. Fail to do this when necessary, and you guarantee those threats will return stronger and more determined to destroy you. The choice is yours, but the consequences are inevitable. Mercy to dangerous enemies is cruelty to yourself. Crushing your enemies totally, when truly necessary, is wisdom that saves you from endless recurring conflicts. Choose wisely.